Hi there, everyone. Welcome back to the Satyrian Technical Series, where we break down SAP Security and Authorization Administration into short, practical how-to videos. Each episode focuses on an SAP tool, function, or concept, helping you understand what it does, when to use it, and how to apply it in practice. In this episode, we'll be covering the STAUTHTRACE, a trace that's used to basically measure user authority checks in real time or short kind of retrospective windows, highlighting the authority checks that are passed as they execute SAP applications or process within SAP applications, but also highlighting any authorization errors that a user has run into during authority checks. An administrator or one that is familiar with SAP can think of it almost as an enhanced version of the classic SU53 report. What I'll be doing today is kind of taking us through the SAP STAUTHTRACE setup, analysis, and then running through a couple examples of kind of use cases as to where we can use it. All right, so pulling up my screen, we'll see we are on our SAP Launchpad Easy Access menu. And as mentioned earlier, we are using transaction STAUTHTRACE, executing our transaction. We'll see that the transaction is switched off or in an off state. We'll cover a couple of these buttons here. First things first is, of course, being able to activate or deactivate the trace. Something important to note in this area is that the trace can be application server specific, or we can perform a system-wide trace. So many SAP systems will have multiple application servers. You can either perform the trace on the specific application server that your target user or user base is operating on, or I find it sometimes simpler or more straightforward to just activate the trace system-wide. And then when we're specifying for our user, we don't need to worry about perhaps activating the trace in the incorrect server and then trying to analyze data for a user that is operating on a completely different server. Just make sure that you're aware of that when making use of the trace. We then have trace options, so being able to trace or activate the trace on only a specific user. So that is possible. A lot of SAP traces, historically, people will recommend that you only leave them active for a short amount of time or a short period of time. With a lot of these newer traces, especially the STAUTHTRACE, it is a rolling history of the trace. So it does have a memory buffer. So as it hits that amount, it will truncate the oldest records in the trace data and kind of continue that rolling period. So I haven't really ever run into much problems with kind of any system effects or kind of negative impact on system performance by leaving this trace active. So typically, day-to-day authorization management scenarios, STAUTHTRACE is a pretty fair shout for keeping a trace active long-term or indefinitely. The one problem, I guess, is if you are working on a very large system and the memory capacity of this trace is not that high, that if you are leaving it active system-wide, you might have a shorter window of results to analyze based on how much activity is taking place in the system. Obviously, the more activity that is taking place at any given moment, the shorter the window of analysis is going to be within the trace to certain users, or maybe troubleshoot along with your end user as they execute so that you can follow along in the background using the trace results that we will see shortly. All right. Once we have the trace results up and running, so what I'm going to do, as I said, a system-wide trace at the moment is just activated. We'll see that the trace has been activated. And we are going to be tracing for system-wide. So we're going to be looking at all users in the environment. Once the trace is active, we will be able to apply restrictions for evaluation of our end users. So what we have here is basically the restrictions of a specific user. So don't get that confused with only tracing for or setting the trace for a specific user. We're now pulling results for a specific user. We're tracing for system-wide. We only want to pull results for one user. That's possible using the restrictions block over here. The date and time for which records are coming from. As I said, typically this trace, as I've seen, you can probably count on the results being within or kept within that trace buffer for about an hour. So a rolling hour or 60-minute period, we can go and pull trace records back from that far. In a standard productive environment, I think that's safe to assume that you've got an hour's worth of history to work with. It can be more or less depending on the activity taking place, as I mentioned earlier. You can filter for specific application types. So if you're aware that a user is making use of a transaction or perhaps a Fiori OData service, an RFC function module, we can trace or filter the trace results based on those application types. A specific application name, if we know the user's working in transaction SE16N or ME21N, whatever you want to identify or restrict on, you can make use of that in the application name. And then, of course, authorization objects, meaning that we can specify for specific SAP auth objects in the trace results as well as the result. Was it a successful check? Was it a failed check? Is the authorization not in the user master? Our typical error codes that we find within our SAP authorization traces, and then of course the maximum number of records. I have found cases where it very quickly exceeds the 10,000. We might want to remove that. It might just take a little longer to pull our records, but then at least we know we are seeing everything and not just the maximum limit that we've set here. Right. And then a couple extra options here along filtering of duplicate entries and evaluating the extended passport of the authority check in the trace. What we'll do now is just set up, now that our trace is running, is just set up an example. Okay. So we can see here we're logged into our tech series demo user. This is simulating from an end user's perspective, a user trying to execute a certain action in the system will then swap back to the administrator perspective or from the trace analysis side of things to see kind of how these actions look in the trace results themselves. Right, so as an end user or with my tech series user, I'm going to try execute transaction SU01. I am going to try and contain my own user, and I run into an authorization error message of I'm not authorized to change users in a certain group, right? As an end user, typically would log a support request saying I'm failing on certain authorizations. Please can you look into this? As an authorization administrator, I'm now going to use my STAUTHTRACE to troubleshoot this request. All right, I am going to come to my system-wide trace results, or now that the trace is active, let me just show you that if I were to load up the STAUTHTRACE again, it is switched on. I just want to make sure that I'm switched to the system-wide trace. I want my time to be accurate, and I'm going to evaluate for, let's say, my tech series user. All right. And to evaluate my results, and I will see the authority checks made by my end user. Separate to the older SU53 report, I'm not only seeing the authorization failures, but also seeing the positive authority checks. There's quite a lot of information available to us here. For example, the date, time, the application server instance that the user is logged into, the application that the user is using, as well as the type of application, the result of the authority check, and then any additional info or access filtering and entities will refer to your CDS views. So those appearing more and more in S4HANA. We can also dive into the access controls of CDS access checks using the report, which we'll cover in a later technical series document, because I think CDS views warrant their own kind of spotlight as we get into more advanced authorization administration topics. All right, focusing on the example for our tech series user, we can see that the user executed or kind of went into their menu, went to transaction SU01. right? The start authorizations required for SE01 being S user group, right? But then when we tried to go into our own user ID and tried to execute or kind of change our user ID, we failed on the authorization check for activity 02 in S user group, and therefore running into our auth error that we see over here. All right. So as an auth administrator, my next job is to, of course, assign the missing authorizations where they are relevant and necessary. I will assign these additional authorizations to the user, and I should then be able to ask the user to retest and make and hopefully be successful in whatever it is they're trying to do. Back to my text series user, just another example of if I am trying to display some table data. All right, I want to get a user to roles report, right? And just stick that to one record just so I can execute it. And let's see the results there. It's a successful check. And let's now maybe go into something like table echo, some purchasing documents. I'm not authorized to display this table because I should only be authorized to some security related tables. All right, let's come and, sorry, I see my time zones are, so adjust my time. Come back into the report and we will see the checks made during my execution or my user's execution of SE16, right? So trying to go into SE16, we see the T-code check for ST code. We then see the successful execution of AGR users, all right? And then we have the failure of the table check for table echo. If we fail on the table name, it will check for the table group. Let's have this, and we see the fail check there as well. And therefore we got the result of no authorizations. All right, just some other common features of the STAUTHTRACE is just being able to export your results to a spreadsheet or any sort of Word document processing up here, as well as being able to look at a specific user buffer. So just to show you another example here is coming straight into the SE56 transaction code or the user buffer of our user. And we can see the user buffer for a specific authorization object. So maybe what I'll do is come back and let's use an authorization object that is relevant to our examples here. So for example, I want to investigate the failed check for STAUTHTRACE. I want to see the user buffer for that object. And what I'll see here is basically the authorizations that the user has for that authorization object. All right, so we can see that, of course, my table EKKO doesn't fit into the range here, and therefore the user has failed. Pretty useful checks available to us inside of the STAUTHTRACE. Hopefully that comes of some benefit and use to you as our viewers. All right, so hopefully some useful information coming from today's session around the STAUTHTRACE and the ins and outs of the SAP application and how it can help us analyze authorization errors and authorization check processing within our end user activities. Hopefully this comes of some benefit to our viewers. We will be exploring some more authorization traces in the next following episodes within the technical series, namely our user authorization trace being ST user trace, and then following with the SAP application authorization trace or the ST USOB trace. Thank you very much for joining us in today's technical series episode, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one.